Good morning, John. You and I are talking a couple of days before the 24th anniversary of 9/11. Can you believe it's been that long?
I can't. I can't believe I've
Yeah.
been alive as long as I have, let alone 24 years since that fateful day.
Well, let's get into that fateful day. How did your day start? 9/11, 2001.
Well, that day started like any day started for me back then when I was still in my late 20s. I was quite dedicated to getting to the gym. I'd wake early each morning, commute into the city downtown, and get in my workout as I often did. And that day I pushed myself on leg day, which is something that I tended to avoid. I think many of us do. Upper body tends to get the preference in our workout regimen, but it was one of those hard leg days, lots of heavy squats, and I certainly felt it. I recall waiting for the shower in the locker room with a couple of colleagues, and there was a line, so I was running a little bit late to the office. So I told them to let the guys upstairs know that I'd be running a little bit behind. And I was, probably running about 15, 20 minutes late, but got through my shower, got dressed, started walking up the stairs from the locker room, really hobbling up the stairs. I mean, this was one of those days, you felt the strain in the quads particularly, and the entire gym just rattled. And in a bizarre way, didn't know what was going on. The entire gym cleared out. I kind of hobbled my way up the stairs, walk out into the street, which was adjacent to the foot of my building, which was, of course, Two World Trade Center. Uh, Lots of confusion, lots of chaos, speaking to different people, lots of people speaking different languages, going to their native tongue due to the emotion and drama. There were pieces of burning fiberglass falling through the air and, strange things happening. No one really knows what's going on. Everything looks perfectly fine where I was sitting or standing, I should say, facing the foot of Two World Trade Center. Because bear in mind, when you're at the base of Two World Trade Center, you have zero visibility to One World Trade Center, which was behind it and, completely obstructed. So I took my cell phone out of my pocket. It was dead. Everybody was trying to use their cell phones. The entire network was down for a host of reasons. I went to the payphone, if you remember those things, picked the payphone up. Those lines were down as well. So couldn't make any phone calls, couldn't find out what was going on. Finally decided to walk up to the revolving doors of the entrance to the concourse of the trade center. And there was a security guard there I was fairly friendly with. I remember this clearly. He was sort of the spitting image of Michael Jordan. So I'll always remember his face. He looked just like Michael Jordan. And I asked him what was going on. And he said there'd been reports that a small Piper jet had hit the other tower, which was kind of the conventional newsflash at that point in time, even within the building. People on the street have been telling me a bomb had gone off in the building behind me. I was getting all sorts of bizarre, conflicting stories. But he told me the building's been cleared. The other building, has an issue, but you can go up if you'd like to. And I literally was about to walk through the doors into the concourse as the second plane flew directly over my head, straight through my desk. Because I worked on the 80th floor of Two World Trade Center, which is literally the entry point. My seat was about 3 feet from the window where the plane entered. So can't even describe the sound and sensation. It was, and to be perfectly honest with you, I had no idea, even as I left the scene ultimately, that that was a commercial airliner. I had no idea what had happened. I thought it was a military attack. Uh, you know, I so I turned, I collapsed, and literally couldn't get up because of my legs. And I'm thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm going to die today because I ripped my legs out. And I really believed that. It wasn't funny at the time. My legs just weren't there for me. You'd assume that when you're running for your life that they're just there, but they weren't. That workout had really taken all of the juice out of my legs. So I was getting trampled. Everybody's panicked, confused. So I'm literally getting trampled, trying to make my way up. But I finally do. I run around, make my way to safety, see police officer around the corner, ask him where I should go. He says, I don't know, just go. Everyone's screaming. So I literally jumped on the nearest subway, the 7 train to Flushing, Queens. But I'm hearing reports on the train at that point that the Pentagon had been hit, and I literally thought it was World War III. As I said, I didn't realize it was a commercial airliner, so I thought we had some sort of a foreign enemy attacking the building. As much as it happened right over my head, it wasn't clear. It was so sudden and impactful. Couldn't get my phone to work. In my frustration, I remember throwing my phone against the door of the subway. It fell into pieces. People were picking fiberglass and dust out of my hair on the train. Um, it wasn't until around 11:30 that morning that I was able to reach anybody in my family. So, everybody thought I was dead. The buildings had collapsed. I had no concept of that. When I finally spoke to my brother-in-law, who was the first person I reached, he told me the towers were gone. And I had no concept of what he was trying to tell me. I didn't even know what he meant because none of us really knew. Obviously, FDNY, no one knew that the buildings were going to collapse, and that was even conceivable. And I'll tell you an interesting side note. I lost a lot of people that day, I should say. Close to 40 people from all walks of life, friends from grammar school, from high school, from college, from my neighbor growing up, colleagues, uh, you know, um, business contacts, you name it. But what my best friend, his father was a retired fire captain from the firehouse across the street, and he was in charge of security for the entire trade center. And he was lost that day. He was lost clearing out the children's daycare center over at the financial center. The buildings collapsed on him. But the really ironic and crazy thing about that is I was at his brother's bachelor party at a steakhouse out in Long Island, I think just about 2 weeks before September 11th, and was sitting next to his father talking about the first attack back in 93. And I was saying, I'd heard that their plan was to detonate a van at the underground one of the towers, so we topple one tower into the other tower and take out all of Lower Manhattan. And I remember what he said to me, which was insane, given the foreshadowing. He said, that could never happen. The only way you're going to take those buildings down is if you fly a small plane into them. And he told me that about 2 weeks before he was lost on 9/11 with the plane going into them. So, you can't make this kind of stuff up. But stories I could tell about the tragedies and the people lost. I didn't do this for decades. For one in one respect, I didn't want to sensationalize it. I wasn't in the state of mind to do it. I declined a lot of, opportunities with the media and other interviews. I've only started to embrace it really recently because it is largely who I am today. So much of who I've become. I think largely the fact that I have no children today is, directly correlated to the path I've been on since 9/11 in a host of ways. So many things about who I am today, the amount of traveling I've done, the places I've lived, are all directly related to the path that I was put on during that fateful day. Trying to embrace life, trying to honor those who didn't have the opportunity that I had to keep going. There's a lot of survivor guilt, obviously, for many years. Maybe PTSD. I'm not going to self-diagnose, and I don't know, if that's always properly diagnosed anyway, but it was certainly a rough haul for me for a few years, and I didn't really talk about it for at least a decade. But there are a lot of things I took away from that day that I took with me that were of value, if you can see the silver lining. And one of the things which I think is of interest to some of the topics that you're focused on was really the power of preparation. Um, you know, our senior management, if I'm honest, we didn't always see eye to eye our organization because we were a Japanese bank and we were a very Western minded staff and leadership, but our senior leadership were rotational staff who came in from Japan. So there's always a lot of friction. They had a very different way of doing business. If you know anything about the way the Japanese do business, particularly in banking, it's quite distinct from the way Westerners and Americans in particular do business. So we didn't always see eye to eye. We didn't always necessarily respect their leadership point of view, if you will. And I had a lot of guilt around that perspective because of the takeaways I'd had of how they managed that day. And again, experience matters. And a big takeaway for me is that experience matters. Our company had been through the first bombing in 93, of course. And as a result of that, the leadership team contracted to have the entire company equipped with what we called an emergency grab and go bag. So everyone in the company had one of these bright yellow kind of waste bags at the top of their desk in their drawer that you saw every day. You grabbed it for every fire drill, which you always took quite seriously, whereas many companies probably roll their eyes, feel it's an unnecessary and intrusion on their work. We always got the value and importance of them, which paid dividends, I would say. Um, but we had things like emergency drinking water, glow sticks, flashlights, face masks, things that we probably got very familiar with during COVID, but weren't so common back then, if I'm honest. And it was just a constant reminder of the importance of human capital in a business and an industry which was focused on financial capital, right? But the moral of the story is, when the plane hit the other tower, those five rotational senior leadership from Japan, I wasn't there. I was on the ground. I was on the street. But from what I understand, obviously, from many of my colleagues who I thought were all lost, who did survive, they were immediately evacuated aggressively, without choice. Everybody get out of there. They ran the floor, circled the floor. Everyone leave, get out, get out, get out. Now, I know many people were lost because that approach was not taken. I know many people who left their floor, went down to the cafeteria. Morgan Stanley had a cafeteria on the 40th floor, 38th floor, I don't recall. Many people got the call to go back up, and they did go back up and were lost. Um, so this approach and this sense of urgency that we're not messing around to figure out what this is, we're going to evacuate. This is all happening, mind you, while the security guard downstairs is telling me it's safe to go up. The management upstairs is telling everybody to get the hell out. So you can see the benefits here. Now, we lost 24 people today, and I can't dismiss that. That's a tragedy beyond words, but it's also, literally a fraction of whom we would have lost. We would have lost, I'd say, probably three or four times that at least, had it not been for this forced evacuation and this mindset of urgency and just the preparation and the experience of having been there and done that and knowing what can happen, right? And I took that with me. I did take global assignments. I adopted a carpe diem attitude largely due to that near-death experience. And I've had a few others. It's probably the most prominent one in my life, but I have had a few others, probably more my fault in other cases. But I was in Asia years later, and I won't get too much into this detail because I actually have a second TEDx talk that I plan to use this, and it'll be part of a book that I'm writing. But I lived in Hong Kong, and I'd moved to Singapore. I had a team in Japan, in Tokyo, and I don't recall what year it was, maybe 2011, I believe. But I was on a trip from Singapore. I was living to Hong Kong, and I was leaving for Japan the next day to visit my team when the Fukushima earthquake took place. And the experience that I had had, where people were lost on the job, and the focus I had in health and safety immediately mobilized. And I had a lot of friction with my senior leadership on that day, which I won't get into too much detail about, but ultimately, I was focused on immediate measures to consider any potential fatalities. However likely or unlikely, they were certainly possible. And that was my immediate focus. There was a lot of pushback around protocols and the politics of disaster, measures and steps that need to be followed to this day. Now, gratefully, we lost no one, but that is not due to the slow response that was enforced. It was due to luck. And experience does matter. You should defer to those who have experience in actual crisis, actual disasters. Fortunately, I'd say there aren't too many people in corporate life who've had the experience of, people dying on the job. But experience matters is the moral of the story. And, there were many people who were lost that day. I think that sometimes gets lost in translation. Of course, all due respect, gratitude, and everything you can say about the first responders and all of the FDNY and others who were lost that day. I can't overstate that. But I do often think it is understated how many people were actual heroes who were lost that day, or maybe not lost, but who were not signing up for jobs where death was part of the job description or part of the risk you're signing up for. And I don't think there's ever been enough credit given to the kind of everyday heroes who weren't first responders. And that's why I feel the story that I tell now is important to let people understand people were lost that day because they were saving lives, including my friend's father, who was a retired FDNY. Um, so moral of the story for me is I am far more focused on preparation and far more respectful in the value of experience, not hierarchy and political protocols, largely as a result of that. So that's kind of my story.
Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.